Hello, Ayo Akinwolere here, and welcome to the Athletic FC podcast. After another defeat, Tottenham manager Ange Postecoglou was quick to accept responsibility. So why are Spurs so inconsistent, and what can they do to fix it? I'm joined by the Athletic's Charlie Eccleshare and also lead writer for the Athletic FC's newsletter, Phil Hay. Now, before we get into this, guys, let's hear from our Tottenham Hotspur writer, Jay Harris, who was at Sunday's defeat to Ipswich.
Tottenham have this really bizarre habit of conceding first at home games. I think it's 14 times since Ange Postecoglou took over, and a lot of the time they come back to win those games. Their powers of recovery are remarkable. They've got a deep squad. It's fitter than last season. Teams can't match their intensity for 90 minutes, but eventually you're going to give yourself too much hard work to do, and that's what happened today. It was a fantastic overhead kick from Sam Smodics. Brennan Johnson probably guilty of not going for the header there, and then Delap sort of bundles the ball over from a really good counter-attack, which actually started with Ipswich's goalkeeper passing it straight to Pape Matar. I think Delap deserves a lot of praise. He gave Pedro Porro and Christian Romero a lot of problems, but Tottenham just failed to build momentum. They've been so inconsistent this season. You know, a couple of weeks ago they beat Man City and Aston Villa. Now they've lost to Ipswich. Crystal Palace and Ipswich have only won one game this season, and for both of them that was against Tottenham. So lots of work to be done. This is now the third international break in a row this season that Tottenham head into off the back of a defeat. So there's work to be done during that time. And up next is the not so easy trick of Manchester City away.
Yeah, quite some stat there from Jay.
I mean, yeah, and this calendar year, it's in Premier League games at home. I think it's 13 out of the 15 they've gone 1-0 down in. Like, it is crazy. And in one of those other ones, they conceded an equaliser to Forest. It was 1-1 quite early. The only time they didn't was they beat Everton 4-0. It's really weird. I mean, like, you think a few times, you're like, oh, maybe it's a coincidence. Maybe we're sort of looking for it now. We're over-indexing it. But it is like every single home game they go behind. And I think it's understandable in a way that Postecoglou does, came out and, took the criticism, took the blame, I suppose, because when it keeps happening that much, you do wonder, like, what's happening? Why are they not going out sort of revved up? It seems like so many kind of these games as well, when they've gone behind as well. I've been at most of those games, and it can feel a bit flat. It's not like these goals are coming out of nowhere. I don't think it came out of nowhere yesterday. Ipswich were playing well at that time. And like Jay says, they're often able to rescue it. So it's sort of less of an issue in a way, or even can be looked at in a positive sense of like, oh, well, they're the comeback kings, they're resilient, they've got character, etc. But the problem is in those games when they've conceded second, which happened against Arsenal last season, against City last season, and now again here against Ipswich, they've lost. So it leaves a very much margin for error. Like, you might rescue it, you've got a decent chance of rescuing it, but you're really making it a lot harder for yourself.
Yeah, Phil, after the Ipswich match, I got a text off a good friend, a Spurs fan, and he was like, you just don't know what you're getting with Spurs. And I wonder what it's like to be a Spurs fan, having beaten the likes of Manchester City in the League Cup and really great victories against Aston Villa. In fairness, Postecoglou took responsibility after that match, as Charlie said. But do you think he's to blame, or is he trying to protect his players?
You're not friends with any Spurs fans.
Come on, man. I'm a proper football fan.
Don't believe that for a second. It's both with Postecoglou. I mean, no manager in their right mind is going to dig the players out in the position that Tottenham are in. It's not as if it's completely falling to pieces or anything like that. It's just been that sort of flip-flop start of kind of swinging from one week to the next between, right, this seems to have fallen into place, and there go Spurs kind of reverting to old bad habits. The reason it's sensible for him to take the blame, certainly to a degree, is because looking at things like the initial concession, the fact that they do go behind, makes you think that it is something to do with the structure of the team, is to do with the way in which they're either motivated or the way in which they're approaching those fixtures. Although I have to say, when you watch it, it's quite hard to put your finger on exactly why it's happening. And I think Charlie's right. Ipswich were playing well in that spell and did score first. And I think is also, to be fair to Ipswich, they've had a win coming, I think, over the past couple of weeks. It's not as if this has been totally out the blue. They should really have won the previous game. They were close enough at Brentford, and that was kind of there for the taking before it all went horribly wrong. So I think maybe unsurprisingly, because Kieran McKenna has everything nailed down there really nicely, and his feet under the desk and very secure manager. That's almost been like a process that they've got to the end of now, where they've got their first win, and it had to come somewhere. But I imagine that behind the scenes, this will be annoying Postecoglou, and it'll be annoying the players as well. And Charlie's right, games where you go 1-0 down, you have to fight back. They can be thrilling and entertaining, but coaches don't like fixtures of that nature. They like to control games. They like to feel like everything is in order, and that it isn't, that kind of desperation of we're behind, we have to dig this out again. And they're just a bit of a mystery, Tottenham, because when they play well, they can be excellent. And when you when you see them click, you're kind of sold on what Postecoglou's doing. It's just that this season in particular, like if you go back to last season, you can almost draw the line between really, really strong start and then fell away after that. This season, it's been far more on one week, off the next. And when they play poorly, you feel as if it's just this kind of constant cycle that they can't get out of. And Postecoglou won't want to be stuck in that cycle. He'll want to sort this out.
Right, can I just say as well, like on the consistency point, because it is crazy, because if we were doing this show literally a week ago, they'd have been fresh from beating Villa. They'd have been basically a win away from going third, which, had they won yesterday, they would have gone third. Instead, they're 10th. And I think we'd all be saying, wow, they've just gone and battered Villa. This Villa team who were doing well in the Champions League and who came fourth last year. And they've got Ipswich next week, which is an easy game on paper. They could be third in the international break. And all of a sudden you're thinking, well, with City faltering, maybe this could be Spurs season. As it is, a week on, we're here and it's kind of doom. Before the previous game, before Villa, they lost to Palace, and that was complete doom and gloom. So like the lurching of emotions, I know this is football in 2024, and especially a team like Spurs who are in that space where you're going to have a degree of inconsistency, but it is kind of mad. And even like the numbers, because you can kind of massage them with Europa League stats, even they're jumping around. So like after Palace, it was, this is awful, we're awful, we lose every game away from home, and Spurs have lost 4 out of the last 7 in the league. Then they beat Villa and it was like, well, actually in all competitions, Spurs have won 9 out of their last 11. That's great. Now it's back to terrible again, and you can say they've lost 2 out of the last 3 in the league, and both of those losses were to teams who hadn't won a game. So it is kind of frazzling, like how much, and who knows, look, they play City next. Maybe they get something there and it's, hold on a minute, we've just taken something off the best team in the country.
Well, look, I was just going to say, look at the headline that was on the piece on the Athletic after they beat Villa. It basically said Tottenham have had a good week, and that's kind of how it is. It was kind of this reflection of actually this week's gone well because previous weeks haven't particularly, and it's kind of this back and forward that I think, if taking a broader view of it, isn't going to get you very far in the Premier League. You can't be this inconsistent and stick around in the sort of position that Spurs want to be in. And that's certainly what I would have said about them as well. It does seem like this constant surge of emotion.
Yeah, I mean, Charlie, back to your point on the Premier League. Look, Spurs have won 5, lost 5, and drawn just once in the Premier League. And I guess we're in the business of trying to pick holes out or trying to understand trends and understanding why this might be. My first thought was European football. Perhaps that has caused havoc for Spurs this season. Or do we then just look at it and say, actually, we're just yet another phase into Postecoglou's rebuild? Not everything's going to go swimmingly well.
Yeah, I think that is true. I think part of the complication is that they started so well last season, and maybe that made everyone think it was going to be a quicker process than they sort of initially thought. Because I think most people were accepting when Postecoglou came in that given they just sold Harry Kane and it was such a mess before under Conte, they knew it was going to be long term. But I think there is always an assumption that progress will basically be linear, and that you will, with a sort of project manager in inverted commas like Postecoglou, you'll sort of just keep getting better. And maybe if you zoom out, that is the case, and certainly like the underlying numbers are good that we'll get into. But I think it's just this frustration because it doesn't feel like it's just sort of gradually getting better. It feels like there are constantly these setbacks. And so I think that's adding to this sense of frustration, because as long as you think broadly things are moving in the right direction, you can kind of accept these things. And most fans probably do, but in the moment, it's difficult and it's frustrating, because just when it seems like, okay, now this is what we were expecting, it's all going to kick in, then they'll have a result like this. So yeah, I do think that's sort of adding to this. This makes it even more frustrating because it feels so tantalizingly close, but it's just still a bit out of reach.
Well, last week, Jack Pitbrook wrote an article on how Spurs under Postecoglou are improving on last season, despite having 10 fewer points. Now, joining us now to get stuck into the numbers, we've got Jon Mackenzie. Jon, thanks for joining us. Look, after 10 games last season, Spurs had 26 points. They now have 16 points after 11 games. Now, despite that, after 10 games this season, most of their key stats were definitely better than the last season. So technically, and we've just been having a bit of a chat about it, are Spurs better now?
Yeah, well, the headline figures are great because Spurs this season are creating more and better chances, and they're conceding fewer and worse chances from their opponents. And this is obviously generally a good thing. If you do that a lot, then you're probably going to win more games than you lose. However, I do think that it is worth throwing in some caveats because these numbers are just from that 10-game sample set that you're talking about, which is the Premier League season so far. And that means the small sample size can give you a bit of skewing if you have any outlier results. So I'll give you an example of that. One of them is that around a quarter of the expected goals total that Spurs have so far this season came in one game, which was against Manchester United. And as you remember, you may remember, Manchester United were down to 10 men in that game. Now, obviously, we don't want to just go around sort of playing with our sample size to make the data fit the things that we want to say. But if you do take that game out of the sample and then rework it out, the XG numbers per 90 actually drop below last season's numbers. So I think, again, just to reiterate here, what I'm not trying to do is rework the numbers so that I can say, oh, look, I'm very smart. I found a way of making them suit my agenda. But, that's exactly what can happen if you take a small sample size and you have an outlier in that number. The other thing to say is that despite the fact that there is improvements in the overall numbers, and obviously when we talk about data, what we're talking about is taking all the numbers and then working out averages. Actually, if you break down some of the games themselves and have a look at them, there's still a sense in which Spurs are a very changeable team. They either blow away their opponents or they struggle to differentiate themselves from their opponents in terms of the numbers. So, for example, again, this season, 4 games, they've put up more than double the amount of expected goals to their opponents, which is obviously an incredible thing to do. And they've won those games quite comfortably. But there's also been 4 games where they've not put up more expected goals than their opponents. And actually those opponents were Newcastle, Arsenal, Brighton, and Crystal Palace. I mean, Crystal Palace at that point hadn't won a game in the season. So, yeah, I would say that the numbers trending upwards is a good thing. But actually, if you start drilling down into that fairly small sample of games, there's a little bit more going on, I think, that should prevent us from just being completely unalloyed in our positivity.
Yeah, Charlie, you did mention it earlier, and I do think about the instant starts that Postecoglou had, that front foot football. Some might say sometimes chaotic, but I wonder how sustainable that is over a period of time. But also, I wonder how maybe even us as journalists get sucked into this kind of conversation about, bloody hell, this is refreshing. This is great to see. And then you get the Crystal Palace, and then you get the really tricky defeats, and you go, why haven't you figured this out? I thought you are on an upward curve.
Exactly. Yeah. I think you think it's done. It's sorted now. Like, why isn't this working? I mean, it reminds me, if anyone's got young kids, like there are these cruel things called sleep regressions. And you're just like, why are you doing that? You know how to sleep. How are you getting worse? That shouldn't happen. It should just be an upward curve and you get better. And I think we kind of think that with football teams and football managers that come in, like Ange, it's just, no, you work it out, you get better. And I guess, especially as the benchmark that's always used for this Spurs project is Liverpool under Klopp and Arsenal under Arteta. And because we don't remember all of that well, we just kind of think, it got better and, over time and improved. And they went from being 8th, both of those teams, to challenging for the league. But within that, there were a huge number of incredibly frustrating, damaging defeats that would have left people in a similar position to where people are now with Spurs saying, is this really working? Because why are they still conceding loads of goals? Why are they still not scoring goals? So there is an element to which these things do take time, and I find it so difficult with a situation like Spurs are in now. You're caught between either you're kind of flip-flopping from week to week, or you're a kind of evangelical, nope, I'm refusing to acknowledge that things are bad. This is my view and I'm sticking with it. And it's really hard not to be one of those two things. Like, my personal view is that broadly, I do think things are working and things are improving. And what other option really does Spurs have but to just give this a go, see where it goes? You know, they've gone through the hiring, firing managers. Like, clearly this is worth, to me anyway, persevering with and seeing where it takes them. And you've just got to hope that these are young players as well. And what's often said about young players is that one thing they maybe lack is the consistency. You know, they'll throw in a bad performance every few weeks in a way that the best players just don't really do that once they're a bit more established. And Spurs, you know, we are talking about a very young team here. So, you know, I think those things will improve over time. But yeah, I think those expectations were there from the start, and there was kind of a feeling that you know, Ange had this way and it was going to work. I think the thing you hear a lot, and he would really, really bristle at this, is this idea that Spurs have been found out. You hear, and a lot of, and that comes from within the fan base as well. I think there is this concern that Spurs, or a perception anyway, they have a one way of playing, and if you can find a way of countering that, they struggle. But then I think what sort of contradicts that is that they come back so often. You know, it's not as if they just give up when they're 1-0 down and say, oh, it's not working. They keep doing it, and it's relentless, and teams can't really handle it until you get a match like yesterday, when all of a sudden a team gets the second goal and then they kind of are able to repel that threat.
Phil, Charlie talks about experience, and I wonder, you know, Lloris isn't there anymore, right? People like Eric Dyer aren't there anymore. People that have been Spurs through and through to a certain degree, especially at the top of their powers. And now I guess we have got a relatively young Bergvall, Gray, Archie Gray, who we previewed a little while ago in the squad, and it's still a squad still trying to understand what those air miles feel like to get a go over the line, don't you think?
It is, yeah. No, absolutely. Spurs constantly interests me because, as it stands at the moment, I was looking back at the last accounts, and the turnover is up at about 550 million as per 22-23, which is the sort of income that most Premier League clubs would kill for, and certainly every club across Europe would kill for as well. It's a lot of money. They have the best stadium in the country, bar none. You could probably go further and say, you know, they have the best stadium in Europe, bar none. There can't be many that really compare. And the squad is good. They have good players, but it seems to forever fall in this twilight zone between being better than, you know, a large chunk of the clubs who are in the Premier League, but not being at the standard of the teams who are above them. And yes, I saw Archie Gray at Leeds. He is a big talent, real talent, who, you know, further down the line could be a really good investment for them, same as Bergvall. But the problem for Spurs is, and I suppose the conversation that they need to have, is how do they, if indeed they want to get themselves into position of being serious contenders, how do they get there? Is it enough to just have this kind of transfer policy? Is it enough to just stand by Postecoglou and to, you know, in the manner of Klopp and Arteta, to hope or assume that over time it does become linear progression and they do get really good? I mean, just to follow up something Charlie said, there's absolutely no point in getting into Postecoglou as a head coach if you're not going to make it long term and if you're not going to persevere with it. I think they absolutely have to. But I think squad wise, they're not in a position where qualifying for fourth for the Champions League, for example, it's not out of the question. It's not beyond them, but it's not a short odds possibility either. You know, I think there are clubs who are better placed to do that. And that's probably, alongside, you know, any tactical changes that Postecoglou has to make, that's probably the step that has to occur in order for them to be stronger than they are.
Yeah, John, that's quite interesting, and I guess it's the $1 million question, isn't it? Will Spurs get better if things keep going the same way they are? I mean, what do the numbers say? I know we've got that, but also what does the pragmatic mind also say as well in this conversation?
Yeah, I mean, if we go to the numbers first, I suppose if we look at Opta's expected points table, which is, you know, basically an expected points table, you take all of the underlying numbers and you run them through these algorithms. And what you say is, in these games, given the chances that they put up, would you have expected Spurs to pick up this amount of points or this amount of points, and it just basically gives you a slightly fairer rendering of the table. And then on Opta's expected points model, Spurs are currently third in the table, which gives you an indication of the increase that we've seen in those underlying numbers. Over the course of a season, you would hope that the fact that Spurs are actually 10th in the table will be rectified, and that you'll see them slightly rising up the table. But so the numbers in that sense are good. I suppose the thing that worries me as a tactical analyst is more about the consistency of this team, because there's so much, as I mentioned before, if you drill down into the numbers, there's lots of games where Spurs will absolutely blow teams away. But then there's other games where they seem to labour and end up losing to teams like Crystal Palace, who hadn't won, and Ipswich, as they did at the weekend. And the question for me is, like, why is that happening? And I think the answer to that probably has something to do with Postecoglou's idealism. I think a lot of fans like to talk about things like plan Bs. But I think actually, if you look at some of the things that Spurs are doing, the problem is that there's not even enough flexibility within the plan A. So there's certain things that you can have a look at as a tactical analyst and see that Spurs are just completely unrelenting. They will go for incredibly aggressive, high pressing sequences when you look at the structure that they're pressing out of, the situation in the game, and you think you're not getting a huge amount of upside from doing that. So I think the interesting thing that I want to see going forward from Spurs is maybe a little bit more nuance in their game plan, recognizing when you're not getting advantages by being aggressive, and that there isn't some kind of moral prize at the end of the season for doing the Postecoglou way all the way through. Sometimes you can actually adapt within your game plan, within your plan A, in such a way as to be able to be more consistently dangerous against whatever team you're coming up against. So that's what I'm looking for going forward. I think the numbers suggest that Spurs will be there and thereabouts in the push for the top four. But I think this Spurs team can be even better than they are now, with just a few little tweaks within the game model that they already have.
Yeah, John, honestly, thank you so much for your time. And Spurs fans, you heard that. There is hope, so do not worry. Jon Mackenzie, appreciate your time, bro.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, Charlie, I mean, let's talk about missing out on Champions League qualification last season. Is that much of a blow for Spurs? Or do you actually think, based on the fact that this squad is still trying to find itself, it could have been a bit of a blessing in disguise?
Well, I was big. It was a weird issue, actually, because it kind of divided the fan base. Normally, like, everyone's so pro Champions League, but actually last season, based partly on the fact that their most recent experience in the Champions League was pretty miserable in 22-23 under Conte, that a lot of people wanted the Europa League. I was massively pro Champions League, just because I think financially, reputationally, in a zero-sum sense as well, with Aston Villa, like, surely you want to be knocking out a rival down to the sort of second-tier competition when you're probably shopping in the same kind of places. But a lot of people did want Europa League. Yeah, I mean, so I don't think it was like a hammer blow in some ways, like, especially because Postecoglou kept saying that he wasn't obsessed with it, and that, it's not, he talked about it not being a Willy Wonka golden ticket, that, getting into the Champions League solves everything, which I think is spot on. It doesn't. It's often viewed as kind of like an end in itself when it should be a means to an end. So I don't think that, like, I don't think they've had like a hangover for not getting in the top four that you see some teams having, because it was like their big ambition. But I do think, and part of the reason as well I was pro Champions League, is I do just think we've been talking, this has been a topic about 20 odd years, but that's Thursday, Sunday routine is just quite tricky. And like these Sunday 2 p.m.ers, this is, when Spurs were kind of Europa League regulars from, say, like 2010 to 2016 sort of time, I just remember so many, it'd be 2 o'clock, it'd be Stoke at home or someone, and it's just a bit flat. The players clearly are not quite there, and yesterday was one of those games. Like, I do just think it is a tight turnaround, and even if you are resting lots of players, or maybe because of that, it is hard to just sort of slip straight back in to, it kind of interrupts the flow a little bit. They beat Aston Villa 4-1, then you're going and playing Galatasaray away, making wholesale changes, which is fine. That's the sensible thing to do probably, but then you're kind of having to pick that momentum back up off the back of a pretty shambolic defeat, which can happen when you make 7 changes. I do think that's been a challenge. And Postecoglou, obviously rejected that, but I kind of think he would, because he doesn't want to give the players an excuse. That said, last season he actually bemoaned the fact they didn't have more games. So, he was always saying he desperately wanted that European loads of games. So I do think he genuinely believes that. But I guess when you are having bad results after Thursday games, which they've had a few of this season, I think it's 3 times they've lost off the back of a Thursday game. You do wonder how much of an effect that has.
The Europa League, though, if it's going to be an advantage being in that rather than the Champions League, there's a finite period of time in which you can say that, because by definition, if you're consistently in the Europa League or thereabouts, certainly for a club like Spurs, you've not made the steps forward that you want to make. Your strongest teams in the Premier League don't sit towards the end of a season and discuss whether they would rather have the Europa League or the Champions League, because they automatically qualify for the Champions League. That's the ballpark that they're in. So you would like to think that potentially for Postecoglou, this could be a season of growth. But if it is a season of growth, and if Spurs are going on to good things under him further down the line, then it will only be Champions League in the discussion, because that is where that's the area that they should be competing in, and rather than being in, as I was saying, that kind of twilight zone grey area of not quite Champions League, better than most Europa League sides, but very much on the cusp of both. It's moving forward beyond that boundary that they want.
Yeah, Phil, on that point, then, I mean, I wonder, we're all football fans, right? And we can only believe that something is working so long as it's not working. Managers can go from being genius to being like, what on earth is going on? People want to see something tangible at the end of it, right? You want to see a trophy. You could even say the same about Mikel Arteta. Of course, he won the FA Cup at the beginning of his tenure at Arsenal, but you want to see something at the end of it. What do Spurs then prioritise on this season? It clearly can't be the Premier League, or maybe it can, but the Carabao Cup's not a bad shout, is it?
I think they have to prioritise the Premier League. I think they can cut the cloth in the Europa League. And I was reading the coverage watched the game, reading the coverage of the Galatasaray match, and it was clear that once Postecoglou started to take big hitters out of that team, it was diminished as it was always going to be, and that's what I was saying about the squad earlier on. So I remember listening to Charlie on a different podcast a while back, talking about Postecoglou when he first came into Spurs and when it first started to go wrong last season. And it reminded me an awful lot of Bielsa at Leeds, because Bielsa was very much plan A, man, don't deviate from that. And Charlie was sort of saying, and he was mimicking pundits on the radio, and he was saying, somebody is going to start saying, I'm sorry, but you cannot play like that. You cannot play like that in the Premier League, and he has to change. And you tend to go through this cycle where once that conversation starts, supporters at a club who really like said coach, i.e. Bielsa or Postecoglou, are uber defensive about it and, really, really resistant to that and fight back against it. But if it goes on for too long, what you start to get on the terraces and amongst the fan base is some of them saying the same, I'm sorry, but we can't keep doing this. And that's, I guess, the risk for Postecoglou if this isn't a strong season and if Spurs don't look like they are moving forward. Tangible progress. It's coming up for 20 years, isn't it, Charlie, since the last League Cup win? So Spurs have been a long time without a trophy. And I think whereas I would look at Ten Hag at Manchester United, and he used to use those 2 trophies he won, the League Cup and the FA Cup, as a bit of a defence mechanism against questions of why he, whether his job should be under threat. And, his job was under threat because he wasn't doing a very good job, to be frank. Whereas to look at Spurs at the best, Postecoglou's got them playing great when they are really good. They just have this, this constant dip up and down of great one week, not so good the next. I think if he wins a trophy, it would please a lot of people at Spurs. But I think if the league position ends up being fairly bang average, the perception of how the season has been will definitely be diminished. I mean, it has to be the case, isn't it, that for Spurs to feel like this is a project that's working and that they are moving forward, that they're starting to get into the mix in the top 4 regularly. That's got to be where it's at.
I do think Ten Hag is such an interesting example of how the perception of cups has changed, because the fact that he won those 2 cups to most outsiders was kind of an irrelevance, which is kind of mad, but it also speaks to the stratification of football, whereby nowadays only really the biggest teams can win the cups, because those cups is kind of an exercise in who has the best B team. because everyone rotates so much. And who has the best B teams? Well, obviously, City dominated the Carabao Cup. Did they do that because they love the Carabao Cup? No, they did that because they had amazing second string players to come in. And so the cups externally don't mean so much. And they don't mean so much, certainly, if you're not showing proper progress in the league, which United weren't. I think where it could be different with Spurs is that if there is a sense of moving in the right direction, but they're a bit wobbly and inconsistent, I think if they're having kind of rip-roaring cup ties, that will shift the dial a little bit. And because there is such a history for Spurs before the last 20 years of being this great cup team, I do think a lot of supporters are just really ready for a cup run. I think that has shifted a little bit from this period where it was all about Champions League, all about, getting in the top four. Now I think a lot of fans would love to win a Carabao Cup rather than getting in the Champions League, which seems, at odds with modern football and is at odds with other clubs, because Man United, they've won quite a lot of things, even when they've been terrible, they have won things. And so I think that will be really interesting to see, let's say Spurs get to the League Cup semis, which is always at like a horribly inconvenient time and you're carrying injuries and it's post-Christmas and whatever. That will be very revealing. How much would they go for that? Or how much would they, they've got some big league games then. How much would they actually say, no, we're still going to prioritise Champions League? And I think there would be quite a divide amongst the fan base as to what they think the priority is, but tilting more towards that, actually, I'm ready for a cup run because it's been so long.
I think that's totally fair enough. And I think actually it's not wrong to prioritise one or the other, provided that your league position in the end is still good. I don't think it has to be fourth for Spurs. But I think if you're a long way off the pace or if it's been pretty mediocre, it becomes quite hard to say, look, this trophy to our left is a sign of great things to come, even though this league table to our right is suggesting that isn't really happening. Although, to be totally fair to Spurs, the comparison with last season, certainly the league table, is one that's best made at the end of the season now, because because of how well they started last season and because it wasn't really a proper reflection of how it was going to go. Likewise, the underlying numbers. I think this is one of those years where you have to give Postecoglou the benefit of the entire stretch to see how much in real terms they have actually improved or not.
Yeah, Charlie, you talk about cup runs or actually hoping cup wins at some point for Spurs. Is that the kind of thing that will unify the club? You think about the Mourinho years, you think about the Conte years, you think about ongoing conversations about where the club is headed. Is that the kind of thing, a Carabao Cup? Do you know what? Finally, there's something to show right now for all we've been through arduously over the last few years.
I think so, to some extent, especially if you think that to win the Carabao Cup, they've beaten City already, they'd have to beat United, and then they'd have a heavyweight semi and final because of the teams that are left in. I think that would be really uplifting. And it would certainly give Postecoglou some breathing space, because it would feel like, you can pitch it as a kind of stepping stone, even if the league form's been a bit erratic. And like Phil says, it doesn't have to be an either or. But I do think it would make a massive difference. Like the atmosphere for them beating City was great. And, even the fact it was far from City's first choice team, but those games, they do take on a life of their own and they can feel quite special. And when you've had a Champions League season like Spurs' most recent one that was just so meh, like I remember being there and it was one of the games, I think it was like Marseille, it was like the first one, and they'd been waiting. It was like Champions League, we're back in the Champions League. And then you're watching it and they ended up winning 2-0, but it was 0-0 for most of it. And you're kind of like, this was kind of our everything. And then it was the same. They played like Sporting and it was 1-1. And it was just like, this actually...
It's like kids in sleep regression, Charlie. This was meant to be amazing. Like, what's happening?
I was going to say, the kids are back.
I know, I can't turn this into a therapy session for myself. But yeah, like, it's not always the be all and end all. And they've had so much Champions League. I think it is just like, we want that day out. We want that win, be that at Wembley or be that Bilbao in the Europa League. Like, it's been such a long time. But yeah, I think that would make a big difference to the general kind of feeling around the place.
I like Postecoglou a lot, and I think he's one of those coaches who there's something intriguing about him, which I think helps people to invest in the idea that this could end up being been really, really good. But I do think that Spurs are going to have to move from a position where he's got a squad where you can say to him, legitimately, that you should be in the mix for fourth place, not necessarily finishing fourth, but you should be on the cusp of that or getting pretty close to a position where he's got a squad where you could actually demand that of him, and you could say to him, you have the resources quite demonstrably to finish in the top four, or to go better than that and to compete in the sort of position that Liverpool, Arsenal, City are in. I do think that has to happen. I don't think this is entirely on Postecoglou. They've got some really good players at Spurs, and I thought Solanke in particular was the right signing for the sort of player that Postecoglou needed in that team. But I don't know whether the supporters at Spurs would agree with this, but it feels to me like they still need to push it further.
Yeah, for sure. Right. There is hope, Spurs. Please hold tight. Charlie, Phil, thank you so much for your time. We'll be back tomorrow. We'll catch you then. If you want to watch more episodes of the show, please subscribe to the channel. We'll be joined by the likes of David Ornstein, Matt Slater, Adam Crafton, Carl Anker, and plenty more through the season. If you'd like to listen to the episodes in full in audio form, search The Athletic FC wherever you get your podcasts from.